So welcome to the French Quarter tour. We're looking at Jackson Square, which originally was Place des Armes. This was a military parade ground from the very beginning. This is where we had public executions because the Cabildo is over here on the left. That was your courthouse, your capitol, and your jail. We had public executions here. We also did have dueling. A lot of the dueling that occurred here, you would bring a weapon, you'd decide the weapon, and I might decide the location. The problem is one of us wouldn't come home. St. Louis Cathedral here has a statue of Andrew Jackson. He was the 7th President of the United States, also the hero of the Battle of New Orleans in 1815 when the British attacked our city. The guy's name was Clark Mills, who was the sculptor. And there is a saying on this statue that's going to talk about the Union must and shall be preserved. That's misunderstood by a lot of people. What Andrew Jackson means by that is that the union of the North and the South should be preserved. Anyway, this guy, Clark Mills, moved to New Orleans several years before the statue went up. He had to find a place to build a hearth, and then it's between 6 and 10 pieces. Some people say 6, some people say a few more. It is a bronze statue. This is Andrew Jackson saluting his troops right before he goes into the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. That's where the British attacked New Orleans, and we shot him and we buried him right where we shot him. That's why you'll see Chalmette National Battlefield. It's also Chalmette National Cemetery. If you look in the four corners of Jackson Square, you will see some statues under the trees. Don sent us a great article, talked about how those statues came from the North. Someone here built the little pedestals for them. They represent the seasons, spring, summer, winter, and fall. Behind us here is going to be the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River was one of the main reasons why Bienville-le-Moyne from Montreal, Canada, established a French colony here, naming it after Orléans, France. You will see several statues in the city of Joan of Arc. We're going to go inside the cathedral, if it's open, and see a statue of Joan of Arc, also King Louis IX of France. Now, when Bienville-le-Moyne got here in 1718, he established the colony for several reasons. One of the reasons was a deep river here. Bienville had established Ocean Springs, Mississippi with his older brother Iberville in 1699, and also Mobile, Alabama in 1702. But beaches have problems. When boats try to come up to the beach, the water is actually very shallow. So here Bienville knew he was dealing with a deep water port, and we are currently one of the largest cargo ports in the United States. Bienville also recognized there were a lot of Indians at this area, which is known as French Market, behind us back over here. That was originally an Indian trading post that goes back over 1,000 years. It was known as Balbancha. Balbancha means land of many tongues. That means many tribes trading there. The Indians realized that when that river took a right-hand turn, when it overflowed, the water would go straight instead of making the turn, and the water carried soil with it. So the Indians recognized that that spot over there by French Market was the highest spot in the entire city, and that's why Balbancha was there. Today, obviously, that being French Market, one of the oldest outdoor trading posts in the United States. You'd also see Café du Monde, which means Cafe of the World. That's a great place for coffee and beignets. We're going to go back to the statue here, and we're going to go talk about this cathedral behind the statue. St. Louis Cathedral is named after King Louis IX of France. He was obviously 12 years old when he became King of France. He was also the only French king to be canonized, which means made a saint. You're going to notice the slogan, "The Union must and shall be preserved." We spoke about that a few minutes ago. There it is on the pedestal. Anyway, back to that clock at the top of St. Louis Cathedral. That was designed by a prominent architect from London, England. His name was Benjamin Latrobe, a very, very talented architect. Benjamin Latrobe designed Philadelphia Waterworks, the Baltimore, Maryland Cathedral, and also the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Back to the left, we do have Cabildo. That was your courthouse, your capitol, and your jail. We do have Napoleon Bonaparte's death mask inside. When Napoleon died, he was in Longwood, St. Helena. His doctor took several death masks. That doctor ended up moving to New Orleans and opened up a medical practice on Royal Street. The doctor brought the mask with him. When the doctor left, he donated the mask to the city, and that's how the mask resides in Cabildo. You also had the very famous court case, Plessy versus Ferguson here. Homer Plessy was 1/8 African American. He jumped on a white train at the Press Street Railroad station and said, "I'm black, but I'm going to go sit in the white car because they're nicer." He drew Judge Ferguson. Judge Ferguson said, "You're guilty." June 7th, 1892. Homer Plessy rests peacefully about 6 blocks behind Cabildo in St. Louis Cemetery, number 1. You also do have the Blue Dog artist. His name was George Rodrigue. We're going to talk about him a little more along the tour. What we will do, since it appears to be open, is we'll go inside St. Louis Cathedral and we'll take a look at the 2 statues that are on the back wall. We'll also talk in a few minutes about several people that are buried beneath that altar. One of those is going to be Don Andres Almonaster. Don Andres Almonaster in the 1770s donated these buildings to the city. They were much smaller versions, though, because we had a fire and also a flood. So we're going to see one statue right here. This is going to be Joan of Arc, obviously 19 years old when they burned her alive at the stake. If you were in France, you'd call her Jeanne d'Arc. The other statue that you're going to see right here, this is going to be King Louis IX of France, looking every bit of the 12 years old that he was when he became King of France. There is an altar over here in the front of the church. Don Andres Almonaster is buried below that. Also a very famous rector. His name was Antonio Sadea. The French called him Father Antonio, so they would have called him Père Antoine. Père Antoine was the rector here when we had the Great Fire of 1788. That fire burned down 80% of the city. You were under Spanish control, so the Spanish built brick and stucco. So what burned is French wood architecture, which we'll see in a few minutes. Again, the Spanish rebuilt the city using the brick and the stucco. We are in Pirates Alley. My joke is, what pirate would hang out between the church and the jail? 1. Andrew Jackson's pirate, Jean Lafitte. Jean Lafitte was a pirate that helped Andrew Jackson and the New Orleanians defend the city when the British attacked in 1815. You wouldn't want to go into the swamps and the bayous without a pirate. If the pirates saw you, they'd just go ahead and jump on your boat and kill everybody, sell your boat, take everything that you had, including your clothes, and sell that at Lafitte's Blacksmith Shop, which is a very famous bar on Bourbon Street. That's where the famous pirate John Lafitte, blacksmith, sold slaves and sold everything he would have taken off your body. What you'll notice over here is the jail bars. Okay, this was the original jail because this was the courthouse, the capitol, and the jail. If you had a hearing up on the 2nd floor that didn't go well, they'd put you right down here in jail. They'd walk you right out here through Pirates Alley into Place des Armes, and it would be your last day. We have a very famous bookstore coming up on our left. This will be Faulkner House Books. This is where William Faulkner wrote his first novel in 1925. It's called Soldier's Pay. This was a very bohemian area. People like Eudora Welty, Tennessee Williams, and William Faulkner wrote novels, drank a lot, smoked a lot of tobacco, and hung out. So we're going to look at the clock back here behind St. Louis Cathedral. There is one on the back side as well. It's going to be at the very, very tip top. We'll also see what's known as St. Anthony's Garden behind St. Louis Cathedral. St. Anthony's Garden is named after Antonio Sadea, who is Père Antoine. But the original garden was not behind St. Louis Cathedral. The original garden was behind the religious building, which is known as the Presbytere. This was the Capuchin monks. The monks were very humble. The monks said, the building's too nice for religious purposes, we have to move out. As everyone locally knows, there's a Mardi Gras museum and also Hurricane Katrina Memorial. The reason why this garden was originally behind Presbytere is because this is where the Capuchin monks were growing their own food. So we're going to go ahead and go from religion to booze. Once we get to Rural Street here, we'll be doing a booze cruise. I want to talk about the hand grenade drink, which is the lime green drink served all over Bourbon Street, and then also the Hurricane, which is a very famous drink invented during Prohibition. We're going to see the original Pat O'Brien's. It's going to be a pink building with light blue ironwork. Pat O'Brien had a speakeasy here, and during the Prohibition it was illegal to buy and sell alcohol, but he was. We're going to see the building right over here. You can see the building in the background. That's the original Pat O'Brien's on the corner of St. Peter and Royal. So Pat O'Brien had his rum stacking up, and the reason why it was stacking up is because if you liked your liquor rep, you bought rum, whether you needed it or not. This is Caribbean rum. They could mark it up quite a bit. You'd still get a decent price for it. So if you liked your liquor rep, you always said, give me a bottle of rum with that, or give me a case of rum. So the rum starts to stack up. Pat O'Brien told his bartenders, make a rum punch. We'll give them 3 fruit juices and 4 shots of rum. One day they served those in lampshade-style glasses with curves, and somebody said from the side, that looks like a hurricane, and that's how the drink got its name. The alternative story is that when Pat O'Brien told his bartenders to make a drink, what they did is they made such a mess that when Pat O'Brien walked in, he said, looks like a hurricane came through here. From Prohibition until about the year 2000, the Hurricane was the #1 drink in the city. We're going to see the top of the Trop. If you look 1 block down and you look to the right, you'll see those green umbrellas that are on that 2nd-story gallery. That is Tropical Isle, but that's the big one. It's called Top of the Trop. We had a 1984 World's Fair called the Bicentennial. A lot of people say it's the 200th anniversary of the very first World's Fair. In reality, what that was the 200th anniversary of the first cotton shipment that went from New Orleans to London, England. Pam and Earl from Orleans Grapevine, which is the 3rd building on your left, the green building. Pam and Earl were the ones that started the hand grenade drink. After the World's Fair, Earl had a bar at the fair known as Tropical Paradise. After the fair, he opened up 5 Tropical Isles. He met Pam Fortner, a blonde bartender from Tennessee, and they wanted to come up with what they would call the strongest drink in the city. As of about the year 2000, hand grenade is the #1 drink in the city as far as number of drinks sold, and Hurricane #2. People talk about the Sazerac drink, saying it was invented at the Roosevelt Hotel in the Central Business District. The Grunwald was the German hotel there, and after World War I, they decided that they would make the hotel change the name. So I've always thought it's possible the Germans had something to do with Sazerac. You'll see an obelisk statue, but behind that obelisk statue, you're going to see a welcome Jesus. My joke is, he's touchdown Jesus, because the Saints certainly need touchdowns. Cincinnati had one, but lightning struck it. If you look down, you'll notice a plaque. This is going to be a plaque commemorating a lady named Henriette DeLisle. Henriette DeLisle started Sisters of the Holy Family. She knew a lot of poor people on the backside of the city behind us needed help. Education, healthcare, religion, and a couple other things. She bought the old ballroom and theater from the city, which is where those flags are on your right. She opened up a convent, a chapel, and an infirmary. In 1964, they outgrew the building, sold it to the Bourbon Orleans Hotel, and they went ahead and moved about 8 miles out to New Orleans East, changing the name to St. Mary's Academy. So the oldest African-American religious organization in the United States is St. Mary's Academy in New Orleans East, and they're actually doing very, very well. We're going to see the Blue Dog artist. His name was George Rodrigue. Everybody knows him about the Blue Dogs. Those of us that know a little bit know that it's much more than Blue Dogs. It's more about Evangeline, who is a fictitious character. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote a poem known as Evangeline. See, George Rodrigue is known for Blue Dogs, but before that, what he did is he saw a man named Andres Molinari from Gibraltar painting bayou scenes. So George Rodrigue started to paint bayou scenes. Evangeline is a fictitious character from Wadsworth's poem. She basically commemorates the plight of the Acadians. They left France in the 1500s due to high taxes and religious persecution. They went to where Nova Scotia is today, calling it the area, Acadie or L'Acadie. The British drove them out, and a lot of them ended up in our swamps and our bayous. But when the British drove them out, according to the fictitious character Evangeline, she was separated from her husband. She found him much, much later on his deathbed. Anyway, that's the plight of Evangeline. Anyway, go to the third floor of the Cabildo, and you'll see that almost the whole third floor is bayou paintings of George Rodrigue, yet somehow he becomes known as the Blue Dog artist. We're going to talk about galleries and balconies. Galleries come a little further out than balconies do. Galleries have poles coming down. You'll notice those Romeo spikes right in the middle of your screen. In New Orleans, Romeo sleeps downstairs and Juliet sleeps upstairs, and the spikes try to keep it that way. You'll also notice fleur de lis, flower of lily. This is the iris that the French are talking about. 3 predominant leaves at the top, 1 for regular people, 1 for nobility, and 1 for the church. We have a football team in New Orleans, which is known as the New Orleans Saints. The NFL called us up in November of 1966 and said, New Orleans, you're going to get team number 16. What do you want to call your team? We said, that's easy. You called us on November 1st, All Saints Day, and that's why we call our team the New Orleans Saints. This is Antoine Restaurant. I noticed that it's named after Père Antoine, who was the famous rector in St. Louis Cathedral during the fire of 1788. He also baptized Marie Laveau, the voodoo queen, in 1801, Catholic. And he married Marie Laveau to her first husband, Jacques Paris. Jacques Paris was a lot older, so 4 years into the marriage, when Marie Laveau was only 22, Jacques Paris passed away. And that's why Marie Laveau is known as the Widow Paris. You'll also notice halfway down the block on the left-hand side a white sign that says Place des Armes Hotel. This was our first school that was built in 1725, meaning 7 years after Bienville established the colony. They had a fire and a flood. They had a fire. Some of the teachers and students didn't make it out, so they closed the school. Thankfully, 2 years later, the Ursuline nuns arrived in New Orleans in August of 1727. That is the first formal educational system that we had for females, and we're going to probably see the Ursuline Convent and Chapel on this tour. Look up, you'll see the gallery, which is a wraparound gallery. That's very desirable because in the summertime you could walk around to the shady side. In the winter you could walk around to the sunny side. Now we're going to look at one of the plaques that's going to be on the wall here. I like to use this to get some of our dates straight. So what this plaque is going to say is it's going to say when New Orleans was the capital of the Spanish province of Louisiana. Okay, I'll use the first whole area here, 1718. That's when Bienville-le-Moyne established the French colony La Nouvelle-Orléans. 1762, shh, it's a secret. That was the Treaty of Fontainebleau. France didn't want anybody to know that they were giving this area up to Spain. 1763, though, that was the Treaty of Paris. That's when the terms came out. So technically in 1762, the New Orleans area became a Spanish colony. I'm going to put a date here, 1788. That's the Great Fire that burned down 80% of the city. What burned was French wood architecture. What the Spanish rebuilt the city with is Spanish brick and stucco. In my humble opinion, that date's wrong. That date should be 1801. That's the third treaty of San Ildefonso. That's when Spain gave this area back up to France. 2 years later, though, we did have the Louisiana Purchase. So I think they're thinking Louisiana Purchase, but third treaty of San Ildefonso in 1801 is when this area became French again. Vampire Cafe. A lot of people say the vampires started in New Orleans when the Casquette girls arrived. Bienville was trying to grow the colony. He wrote a letter to France saying, send us some more females. What arrived is 14 and 19-year-old ladies. They arrived here pale, a little malnutrition due to a very long voyage. Being pale and each one of them having a wooden box with their belongings, the locals said, you look like a ghost and you got vampires inside your mini coffin. New Orleans Vampire Cafe does a lot of business. Obviously, the younger generation is fascinated with vampires and ghosts. Now, we have a building here which is called a Creole Cottage. The Creole Cottage was simply a very small house. You probably thought you were renting your entire life. Then one day you came into a little bit of money and realized that you would be able to be a homeowner. So you'd buy a small lot. Being that the lot was very small, you would actually build a house that occupied the entire lot. So in many cases, no yards, which means you can touch the Creole Cottage from the sidewalk. If you do have a yard, it might be a small yard in the back, just giving you privacy from the street. This Creole cottage is going to be 2 rooms in the front, 2 rooms in the back, 4 rooms in a square, no hallway. But the roof always ran the same way as the street, and the reason is simple. We're trying to get the rainwater into the street, because we were going to the bathroom in buckets before we had a sewer, and we dump our buckets into the street at night. So when the Creoles all agreed we'd pitch a roof that ran the same way as the street, they were just trying to make the city smell better, and it actually worked. The city still smelled, but not nearly as bad. The fire of 1788 did occur on Good Friday. That was a religious holiday. The famous rector, Père Antoine, at St. Louis Cathedral couldn't ring the bell. He couldn't work. So the fire burned down 80% of the city, and apparently the fire stopped in this block. We're going to go around the corner. We'll see Madame John's Legacy, which is a very, very famous house, and it represents what the city would have looked like before the fire, being French colonial architecture for somebody that had money. If you didn't have any money, that would be your Creole cottage, and we'll see more of those as we go around the corner. I want to talk about Cajun versus Creole real quick. Creole means born in the colony. Anybody born in New Orleans after 1718, we called you Creole. The Portuguese word Criollo is where it comes from. It implies a blend. Think crayon or Crayola, many different colors. Anybody born in the city after 1718, regardless of your ethnicity or your skin color, we called you a Creole. Cajuns or Acadians were very different people, again being farmers in France in the 1500s, leaving France by boat, going to where Nova Scotia is today, calling it the area, l'Acadie. The British forced them out in 1760 area, approximately 1762, and a lot of them ended up in our swamps and our bayous, but that was them coming to New Orleans on their own volition later. A lot of the boats, a lot of those people were put on boats, and the British wouldn't even tell you where you were going. Some of the boats went to the eastern seaboard, states like Maine, and that's why you'll see the German instruments playing the Cajun music in the Northeast. Some of those boats went to Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti. That would have been a pretty good area to go to. After the fire of 1788, though, you would have probably come to New Orleans to help us rebuild our colony, and that's where the Bright Island colors come from in the French Quarter. And then obviously some of those boats went down to South Louisiana. This is you on your own volition, though, coming later. What you're bringing to South Louisiana is hope that you can start a new life, and when you saw the flat land, you were a farmer. So you knew that you could make a new living here, but what you also found in South Louisiana is going to be what I call the best pantries in the entire world, according to Chef John Folse. Crawfish, crab, shrimp, oyster, alligator, venison, wild hog, turtle, possum, the list goes on. But in the bayou, unlike a city meal, which is a meat, a starch, and a veg on a plate, with possibly your city mother sauces, tomato, hollandaise, espagnole, bechamel, and the gravy sauce, velouté. In the bayou, we typically smother things out of one big pot. Typical dish, jambalaya, jambon, the French ham, a la yaya, ham with rice. The idea of beans with meat came from Cuba, then that went to Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti, and then it arrived in New Orleans. We're looking at Madame John's Legacy here. This is a very, very famous house in the French Quarter. It's a one-of-a-kind. In the 1980s, the state of Louisiana bought it with the idea that at some point this would turn into a museum. The idea is simple. This is what it looked like before the fire if you had money. If you didn't have money, your Creole cottage. If you look carefully down the sidewalk, you'll see all the Creole cottages with the roof running the same way as the street. Madame John's Legacy is a beautiful example of French colonial architecture. We had an author who wrote a short story. His name was George Washington Cable. The short story was named Tite Poulette. In Tite Poulette, a man bequeaths to his mistress a house in the 600 block of Dumaine, this obviously being the house. And basically what we're going to look at here is going to be this dependency, the French dependency. It's a back house. Madame John's Legacy has 2 dependencies. If you're in Europe, you probably call this a granny flat. But Madame John's Legacy has 2 dependencies. One would have been for your help at the time, probably slaves. The other one that we can't see on the left-hand side is going to be for the chef. That obviously indicates that whoever was in this house at the time had a very, very high opinion of the person doing the cooking. Also, one of the people that lived in the house here, but it was the building before this, would have been one of the pirates' lieutenants, Jean Lafitte's lieutenant. But that doesn't make your house famous, neither does Tite Poulette. What makes this house famous, though, is going to be supply and demand. Show me another house like this in the French Quarter, you're not going to be able to. They're having problems with the Vieux Carré Association. The state owns it, but the Vieux Carré Association is trying to tell them what to do, so construction's been halted. What you'll notice about the ironwork down here on the bottom is this is meant to mimic the ironwork that was done at the Presbytère, which is the religious building. I think the structure of the ironwork looks good. I'm a little disappointed in the fact that we'll be seeing a lot of rust soon, and here's why. Whoever did this didn't prime very well. You need to prime several times. Paint is simply just an oil coloring. Primer is the chemicals that prevent the rust formation. So we're going to see a voodoo sign right down here on the right. We'll see that in a minute. That's Voodoo Authentica. Voodoo was a religion that started in Mesopotamia area, according to many people, and when it arrived in Africa, it picked up the name for God, which was Vodun, so they called the religion Voodoo. I tell people, if you want to learn more about voodoo, go inside, maybe come home with a gift. Voodoo Authentica, a great cultural center and collection. What we're going to see is the pink dependency, the back house across the street. There's a dependency here. There's also going to be a dependency right here on our left, although it's tiny. We're going to go look in the courtyard here. The dependency of this home is tiny. You'll see there's a small courtyard, and then the French dependency in the back. After the fire of 1788, we had a law that said if you have a fire, you have to have a water feature. And the reason is simple, is you need to put your fire out. Again, that fire being on Good Friday, a religious holiday. The rector, Père Antoine, couldn't ring the bell, and that was your fire alarm. Typically what a bell showed is three things. You have a break in the river, which is known as a crevasse. We didn't have a sewer system, so there would have been no place for the water to go. The other thing it's going to show is a break of the prison. So you'd have a lot of criminals running around, and then the other one obviously being a fire. The original streets in the French Quarter were dirt, then they were cobblestone, and then they were paved. You'll notice these are not made for cars, these were made for mule-drawn carriages. So you're going to have French wood architecture burning. The wind was coming in from the southwest, which means it was blowing that way, which blew the fire to your right. French wood architecture burns, Spanish like brick and stucco. We weren't very good with brick in the beginning. We would get our mud out of the Mississippi River right over here. It didn't have a lot of clay content, so it made a red brick, which was so-so. The Spanish knew that there was more clay content in the mud in Lake Pontchartrain behind us, so the Spanish ended up making a better brick. So we're going to walk down Charter Street here, and we're going to notice the first building on the corner to the right is a big yellow building. That'll be the pasta factory. Any local probably remembers delicious meals at Irene's. Irene's has moved about 8 blocks behind us, but before that this was the pasta factory. People called this macaroni. Now between 1850 and 1870 we had more Italians and Sicilians in the city than Chicago and also New York. One of those was a famous Sicilian named Salvador Lupo, and in 1920 he's going to make the muffalata sandwich. 3 deli meats, 3 deli cheeses, and an olive tapenade salad, all served on an oversized hamburger bun. What we're looking at right here is going to be an entrance into a courtyard, only this is a carriageway. Carriageways were very, very popular. The steamboat is what made New Orleans blow up as a port. So you're going to have mule-drawn carriages that would come off the street and go right through the building. You have a courtyard in the back and the French dependency. So as the boss, you would just take the mule-drawn carriage, go through the opening here, hop off in the courtyard. Your help or your slaves would take over, and then you'd come back into your business downstairs, and you probably lived upstairs. Typical carriageway and courtyard scenario. I always tell people when you're in the French Quarter, you don't really know what it's like to be in the French Quarter because of all the noise on the streets. what you probably want to do is find your way into a courtyard, maybe go into a hotel, and notice how quiet it is. So it's absolutely a lot quieter in the French Quarter than most of us realize. There are also a lot of buildings that don't have any connection to the street, so you'd be having to go through an alleyway to get to the apartment or hotel area. So much quieter in the middle of the block. This is going to be Irene's. This was a laundry facility. They made garments, hangers, and things like that. Later on, Irene's took it over. As I mentioned earlier, Irene's is no longer in the building. They're about six blocks behind us, closer to Canal Street. So the next stop is going to be the Ursuline Convent and Chapel. That'll be 1 block further up. The Ursuline nuns arrived in August of 1727. Again, first formal educational system for females in the colony. Ursuline Academy is alive and well, 6 miles behind us, uptown. That's going to be the oldest private girls' school in the United States. What you'll notice is that as you get further away from Place des Armes, which became Jackson Square, 3-floor average on the building turns into 2-floor average. The further you get away, it turns into just smaller as far as number of stories. That indicates all the business that took place on the Mississippi River once the famous steamboats arrived in 1812. Obviously, the people that came to New Orleans were not French Creole. These were American Protestants with money who spoke English, so they lived on the other side of Canal Street behind us, originally calling that Faubourg Sainte-Marie. Faubourg meant neighborhood. Sainte-Marie was the area. Some people called it Faubourg Sainte-Mary. Anyway, we used Canal Street as a neutral ground. You'd go do some trading with your friends on the other side of Canal Street, but you'd always go back on your own side. We didn't agree on street names. Bourbon Street might become Carondelet Street on the Central Business District side. We're coming up to a very famous building. This is the Ursuline Convent and Chapel. Again, the Ursuline nuns arrived in August of 1727, and in my opinion, they never left. The original convent and chapel would have been really, they say, right next to this convent and chapel. The building date here is 1754, but we built one before that, again, not being very good with brick and stucco. So the building fell, and we have maintained this ever since. So with the date of 1754, that makes this the oldest building in the entire Mississippi River Valley. Right across the street is going to be the Beauregard Keyes house. A man named Le Carpentier, a Frenchman, approached the Ursuline nuns and asked if he could buy the land here. Well, he bought the land, and he ended up building a residence with a beautiful courtyard, which you'll see right here. Paul Morphy, the famous chess champ, lived in this house with the columns right here. When Paul Morphy was 9 years old, he was the best chess player in New Orleans. By 14 years old, he could beat anybody. Paul Morphy also lived on Elysian Fields, the Green, Wraparound Gallery, right by Stop 3. It's right across the street from the Stop 3 sign without having to cross Elysian Fields. They call this the Beauregard Keyes house. P.T. Beauregard, who fired the first shot at Fort Sumter to start the Civil War, lived in that house. And Francis Parkinson Keyes, or Keyes, K-E-Y-E-S, however you pronounce it, wrote a very famous book called Dinner at Antoine's. But if I had to change the name of the house, it would be the Beauregard Morphy house. Anyway, you'll see a beautiful courtyard. Again, we're on the corner of Ursuline Street and also Charters. So we're going to look down this street on the left, and you're going to see a hotel right here. And when we get a little closer, I'll explain the significance of this orange hotel. That is Villa Convento. And a lot of people say that this is the House of the Rising Sun. So we're going to turn around and we're going to head back towards Bulbancha, the Indian trading post. Again, Bienville Lemoyne sought high ground. He also saw a big curve in the river. Being a high point and a curve in the river Bienville-Lemoyne decided that what he would do is go ahead and put a fort there. The original fort was called Fort St. Charles. When the Spanish took over, they called it Fort San Carlos. Also of note, obviously, the Ursuline nuns being in a very, very high spot as well. When we had the fire of 1788, the head nun supposedly had a statue of Jesus, and she was standing in the hallway hoping that the fire would spare the convent. It did. The convent is right here, and the fire stopped about 2 blocks towards the west, so they were spared. Again, galleries and balconies. Galleries come further out. I love the galleries. That's a French balcony, if you look straight ahead. The French love balconies, but balconies don't come far enough out for me. I like to be outside, so typically a gallery will come all the way out to the street, and that's why you see the poles right by the street. A balcony typically only comes halfway out, but it is supported by this wrought iron structure. We're coming up to my favorite part in the entire city. This is going to be French Market. Again, this was Balbancha, the Indian trading post. Our founder, Bienville-Lemoyne, loved the Mississippi River. I felt sorry for La Salle in 1682. La Salle was trying to find the mouth of the Mississippi River. He ended up in Texas and ended up declaring the Mississippi River for France. I would have said, come and get it, especially when Napoleon Bonaparte was negotiating with us during the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon was at war, needed money. What we wanted was control of the Mississippi River. The date was 1803, but steamboats didn't arrive in New Orleans until 1812. So what's the difference with the dates? It's simple. What was floating in the Hudson River in 1787? That was a small steamboat engine designed by a man named John Fitch. So we realized that we would have steamboats in the river, and that's why we wanted it. So we gave Napoleon Bonaparte 15 million. He gave us about 13 states worth of geography. Very important, because that also helped us make sure that the western side of the river stayed part of the United States. They could have broken off on their own. And obviously, once the steamboats arrived, everybody moved to New Orleans with money. Typically Protestants from the Northeast, so they moved on the other side of Canal Street, way over there, which is the central business district. Some of those heard that in 1832 the famous Liverday plantation came up for sale. They negotiated with Celeste Liverday, but Celeste's real name was, her maiden name was Marigny. That was Bernard de Marigny behind us, the Marigny neighborhood. That was his younger sister. Apparently Jacques Liverday from the Garden District loved younger women. Celeste is 13 when they got married. 4 years into it, Celeste realizes her husband is an alcoholic and a gambler. She divorces him. He doesn't show up in front of the judge. The judge gave Celeste the entire plantation and also $175,000. That was the year 1832. The Americans bought the area, which is now Garden District. Didn't want the Creole from the French Quarter here. So what the Americans did is they hired an architect, really a surveyor. His name was Benjamin Buisson, and in 1832 he surveyed the area. They made blocks about the size of what's there now, and went ahead and said, okay, we're not going to want the Creole in the neighborhood, so the smallest lot available on the whole block will be 1/4 of the entire block. Think about that. Everybody had a corner location, but you might have bought half a block. You may have bought a whole block, like Herman did. There was a famous block called the Herman Square. Herman bought the whole block. Obviously, they called the block squares back then. Also, for future reference, look up Toby's Corner. A man whose last name was Toby bought lot number 1 out of 172 lots. It's called Toby's Corner. He found out General Pershing was coming to New Orleans. He was going to be staying in the Garden District. Toby thought General Pershing was staying at his house. And what he didn't realize was that General Pershing wouldn't end up staying there. So what he ended up doing is making a very fancy bathroom in the back of Toby's Corner, and General Pershing never made it. Anyway, so we're back here at French Market, and what we're looking at here is going to be a lot of food and beverage. I recommend Loretta's praline stuffed beignet. And then also a little further up on the left, this is going to be a flea market. And then if you look straight ahead, you will see Fort St. Charles, that red building. Fort St. Charles obviously was originally there. Later on it becomes a U.S. Mint. Tour guide Logan talks about that being a prison as well. That's true. And then later on this becomes a jazz museum where we honor jazz greats like Louis Armstrong, our father of American jazz, who was born in 1901. They called Louis Armstrong Satchmo because they were calling him Purse or Satchel Mouth. He thought people would take his money, so when he got paid for his gigs, Louis Armstrong put his money in his mouth. So Satchel Mouth became Satchmo. I'm going to end this tour early, and I'll probably end up doing another one, but thank you very much for viewing. I know I talked a little fast, but I wanted to try to get a lot in. Anyway, almost on cue, we'll end the tour with a little bit of music. Let's keep going. We're going to talk about the Marigny neighborhood. So there was a sugarcane plantation on the eastern side of New Orleans, and it's going to be on the other side of the original Fort St. Charles. The man's name was Philippe de Marigny. In the year 1800, Philippe de Marigny died. He was an astute Frenchman, French beliefs to the core. At that time, when he died in the year 1800, Philippe de Marigny ended up willing his plantation to his son. His name was Bernard de Marigny. Bernard de Marigny de Mandeville was whatever a lot of people call him. Anyway, Bernard de Marigny de Mandeville ended up being a playboy and also a gambler and an alcoholic. When he was about 13, his parents sent him to Europe and told him to get an education. As our tour guide Ray talks about, rather than buying his books, he got a flat next to a casino and taught himself how to gamble. What he ended up doing is bringing the dice game craps to New Orleans. Crapaud is the French word for toad, implying that's the toad-like position that you get into when you're rolling the dice in the game craps. So Bernard de Marigny comes back. He is an alcoholic and a gambler by 15. His father dies, obviously, so Bernard gets the entire plantation. He grows up to be a drunk and also a gambler, but one thing he did was he became president of the Louisiana State Legislature. I believe the year was 1823. As president, he said that any French ought to continue to be the official language in the French Quarter because there was a movement to make English the official language. Bernard de Marigny also said that kids who were born and adopted should have the same legal rights as naturally born kids. Bernard de Marigny definitely helped out in the Battle of New Orleans when the British attacked us. Bernard de Marigny also, due to his gambling, had a church, 2 churches on Burgundy Street that was part of his area, and he changed the name of Burgundy Street to Craft Street. The churches were upset. It took them a while because they didn't want to be the 2 churches on Craft Street, and they finally convinced Bernard de Marigny to go ahead and change the name back. If you crossed over Esplanade Avenue, which is about a block or 2 right over here in front of us, you'd find Frenchmen Street. We talked about the Treaty of Fontainebleau in 1762 that led to the Treaty of Paris in 1763. This is going to be France giving this area up to Spain. There were some French people in the French Quarter that were not very happy with Spain being the new ruler of the colony. They voiced their opinions, they were heard. The Spanish sent in Bloody O'Reilly. Bloody O'Reilly arranged for a dinner with some of these Spanish people to meet with these French people and somehow work things out, but it was a trap. When the French people got to the home for the dinner, they were brought out in the backyard, apparently after dinner, and executed. That was a message to the French people that Spain was in town. Now, Bernard de Marigny ended up naming Frenchmen Street after these French people that were assassinated. Bernard de Marigny ended up dying on Frenchmen Street. He was approximately 82 years old. I've read he only had about a 2-bedroom apartment at the time, and he was down to 1 servant. Bernard de Marigny also had a job. Apparently he worked at the Recorder of Mortgages. And my joke about Bernard de Marigny is that he'd probably sold off so much property to pay off his gambling debt that when he walked in the Recorder of Mortgages, they were like, "Hey Bernard, what are you selling today?" But only Bernard said, "Hey, I'm here looking for work." And knowing that they had seen Bernard de Marigny for so long, coming in as a busy customer, they probably said this would be an easy guy to employ, and that's how Bernard de Marigny got his job. It sounded like it was a heart attack or a stroke. He died on Frenchmen Street and just fell to the ground. Anyway, that's our tour. Sorry about the fake ending. Hope you enjoyed the music, and see you on the next one.